Welcome everyone to this FAIR webinar entitled Anti-Semitism on Campus, Balancing Student Safety and Civil Liberties. I'm your moderator, Jonathan Kay, an editor at Quillette and an advisor at FAIR. And I'd like to thank Monica Harris and Leigh Ann O'Neill, our hosts, for making this event possible and having me participate. And as the title suggests, tonight we will be looking to examine the tension between our strong desire to protect students from anti-Semitism while also leaving space for a robust and free exchange of ideas on campus. It's a topic I am particularly happy to be talking about because I think, like most people here, I think these are both goals worth pursuing, and I'm interested in where the proper balance lies between them. And as with all FAIR events, we're hoping that the discussion here, including the Q&A, will come from a place of respect. Fortunately, this is not Twitter, where even one wrong word will get the whole world jumping down your throat. So we can express ourselves with greater nuance and greater freedom in the expectation that people will engage with ideas they agree or disagree with rather than simply attacking the speaker. That said, we have three great panelists tonight, each of whom will speak about these issues from their own experiences. And when that part is finished, there will be a more general Q&A session where people will be able to ask questions. And the way that will work is that audience members can type their questions into the chat, and you can do this on an ongoing basis. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to start. And there will be people, including me, looking at these questions and then putting as many of them as possible to the panelists in the 45 minutes or so that should be remaining toward the end of the evening. I will give a necessarily brief introduction to the panelists. They're very accomplished, so we don't have a ton of time, so I'll just give you the highlights. The first you will hear from is Professor Jeffrey Lax, who, as well as being a law professor at CUNY, is also the founder of S.A.F.E, that's S-A-F-E, which is a group dedicated to advocating for Zionist Jews subjected to discrimination on university campuses. And then will come Sahar Tartak, a young champion of free speech and ideological pluralism who gained national attention in this regard when she fought back against her Long Island high school administrators a few years back, at which time I interviewed her for the Quillette podcast, if I remember. And she is now a sophomore at Yale, where, as I understand it, she is waging similar battles. And it's great to have a young person who could tell us what it's like to be a student on campus. And we are also honored to have Nadine Strossen, a veteran American civil liberties activist who was the first female president of the American Civil Liberties Union, which, as I understand, she led from 1991 to 2008, which is a long time to have any job without getting canceled. She is now a professor at New York Law School and, I just learned this, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And so we're going to start with Professor Lax. And I guess my first question, just to get the ball rolling, is, Professor Lax, when you started your group, is this exactly the kind of situation that you had in mind, or is what you've seen over the last, I guess, 5.5 weeks, has it been maybe a surprise even to you, the level of hostility that some students are facing on campus?
Well, and first of all, thank you for having me. Such an important discussion, and I'm so it always gives me strength to see a student have the bravery to come forward and have this discussion. So I just want to, at the outset, commend Sahar for her courage and her bravery, and I wish every student had that. I wish all my students had that, and I really want to commend her for that. I think there are two different sides to that question, Jonathan. It's an excellent question. You know, did I expect this? I've been yelling and screaming about how bad things are and scary things are in the insides of academia for about 8 or 9 years already. So I was recently asked on another podcast, were you surprised at the reaction to what happened in Israel, the October 7th attacks, and then the reaction from the public and from pro-Palestinian groups and from, frankly, pro-Hamas groups coming out? And my answer to that question was, I was not even the least bit surprised about the horrifying response that some campus faculty groups and some campus student groups were promoting on campuses, outside of campuses, in their rallies, frankly, in some of their riots, calling for genocide of Jews from the river to the sea, calling for, defending Hamas, defending what Hamas did. And I keep saying this because I really wanted to stick somewhere. And I hope the history books will record this, that everybody remembers that Israel was attacked viciously and Hamas was defended vehemently before Israel ever fired one bullet into Gaza, before Israel took 1 foot towards Gaza. Israel was attacked after their women were raped, after their children were burned, after their children were decapitated, the most horrifying inhumanity that we have seen since the Holocaust. And Israel was attacked in the hours and days after that by campus groups, by student groups. And I was not surprised about that part of it because I have seen this hate in the background for so many years. And I've known that I think what really happened for the first time is not that anyone's views changed. These people who are coming out and defending Hamas's actions and attacking Israel after they were in, while they're still basically, the bodies are still warm, they were attacking Israel. These people always had these views. What happened for the first time was the wool got pulled back. The wool got pulled back from behind their eyes, because what were they saying? They were saying things like, well, you can't look at rape in a vacuum. You can't look at rape in a vacuum. Think about that for a minute. Well, what is that telling people? That some women deserve to be raped? Is that the society that any of us grew up with? Like, I first responded to a podcaster that, no civilian woman ever should deserve that. Obviously. But then I thought to myself, wait a second. No woman, why am I saying civilian? If you're a female soldier, you don't deserve that. If you're a soldier of any army in the world, you don't deserve that kind of horror. But yet these people were saying that rapes did not occur in a vacuum, and that setting babies on fire, my goodness, babies, and decapitating them in front of their families don't happen in a vacuum. Yes, they do happen in a vacuum. There is no prior history that justifies going out and doing these Nazi-esque things that were done to these Israelis. And so like, what happened in Israel that day, did it shock me? Yes. The things that happened shocked me because previously I had only heard about it from my family, from my Holocaust surviving grandparents. So the things that happened, Jonathan, shocked me. The reaction on campus, I am so sad to say, did not shock me, because what they've always been saying is, we have the BDS movement, for example, groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace, the BDS movement. All they say is, we don't have a problem with Jews. We're not anti-Semites. We don't have a problem with any Jewish civilians. All we have a problem with is the policy of Israel. So we now know, the whole world now knows, the line has been drawn so clearly that is not true, because they went out and they raped civilians and they beheaded civilian babies and they set on fire civilian babies. What does that have to do with Israeli policy? Is a Jewish baby a settler? Is a Jewish baby a colonizer? Is a Jewish infant a Jewish supremacist? I mean, it's sick. So the wool was pulled back on their eyes, and I always knew that. I always knew that this idea of we have a problem with the Jewish government was never the case, but the line was clearly drawn on October 7th. That's why so many people are reacting the way they are, because now it's clear. It was never that they had a problem with policy of a government. That was never what it was about. The actions of October 7th and the defense of them proves that's never what it was about. What it's about is they have a problem with Jews being there. They have a problem with Jews being, frankly, a lot of places. And that's what it all comes down to. So I was shocked by the horrors that happened. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime. I was so sadly not shocked by the reactions of faculty groups and some of the, the really extreme student groups.
So in your capacity with SAFE, you have to evaluate what forms of expression on campus amount to a defense of these kind of horrors you're describing. By my observation, often people will talk in euphemism. You have seen faculty and students, in some cases, it's been captured on social media, tried to explicitly defend the kind of horrors you're describing, but more commonly, you'll see people chant things like, from the river to the sea, which these are slogans that connote the expulsion or worse of Jews from Israel. Although, as I say, more commonly, people won't actually say, we need to go out and kill Jews or whatnot. Have you thought as an organization, talking here about SAFE, where the line is between legitimate speech and a sort of genocidal hate speech? Like, is that an issue that you've had to wrestle with in the last period?
Yeah, that's a great question too, and I think you are on that line. When you say things like globalize the Intifada means bring violence to Jews everywhere. That's not free speech. That is not free speech.
It is free speech. Sad to say. I mean, I don't think it's sad, because I think Jews above all depend on free speech. But if it's not my turn, I'll just give a preview that we have a respectful disagreement on that point, Professor.
Okay, so I'm just gonna put a marker on that we're gonna get a more expansive argument about where the boundaries of free speech lie. But as I understand, Jeffrey, Professor Lax, you would look beyond the euphemism, and maybe you think university, like if university protesters were going down the quadrangle and saying, from the river to the sea, from the river to the sea, let's deal with the problem, globalize the Intifada, like, would you want university administrators to block that kind of demonstration?
Well, I'd love to hear Professor Strossen, Nadine, your position on that. I'd love to hear that. I suspect we don't disagree on the definition of incitement to violence.
Exactly. And it's not my position, Jeff. I'm talking about the United States Supreme Court, which unanimously, as you well know, since 1969, with not a single dissenting justice since then, saying that even advocacy of violent and lawless conduct is constitutionally protected. The line is drawn at intentional incitement of imminent violence that is likely to happen imminently. And the examples that you're talking about, hateful and despicable as it is, and believe you me, my father was a Holocaust survivor. Many of my family members were slaughtered by the Nazis. I could not hate that speech more. And I agree with you. We can call that hate speech. We can call it terrorist speech. But it does not satisfy the appropriately strict standard for intentional incitement of violence. And I do believe as a Jew that protecting freedom of speech, even for repugnant, hateful advocacy of violence, is especially important for Jews and other minority groups, because we are never going to have access to majority power, and we therefore especially depend on robust freedom of speech. But this is an argument that I know many Jewish people disagree with. I respect that. The debates in my lifetime go all the way back to when I had first graduated from law school in the late 1970s, and the ACLU was famously or infamously defending freedom of speech for neo-Nazis in Skokie,
Illinois. Yeah.
Same principle.
Yeah. So let me respond to that, because she brought up some very substantive issues that I fundamentally disagree with. So when you're talking about incitement to violence and the likelihood, part of it is the likelihood that violence will occur immediately following that speech. We have quite a number of examples, even within my own university, of that happening. When Fatima Muhammad and Nardine Kiswani were screaming, globalize the Intifada, and from the river to the sea, there was a Jewish student that was beaten up and ended up in the hospital.
But you
right
know
there.
that the assault is, of course, criminal conduct that should be.
Well, I'm not talking about the assault. I'm talking about the speech that led to that assault. To disconnect that speech from the immediately occurrence of an assault is, to me, incitement.
I would
definitive.
have to see the details, Jeff. You know, if it's targeted at a particular person and saying, you know, go beat the Jew, that clearly is punishable.
Could I just interject a little bit here? Because we have two very, very smart lawyers here. And I think the constitutional discussion is in the limits of free speech is interesting. I also think it's interesting to look at this from maybe the more specific perspective of university administration, and maybe like there's some captive audience arguments here. I know that First Amendment protections are sometimes a little looser when you're maybe talking about a captive audience, which arguably some students are. Before we go to Sahar, who's going to give us a perspective of somebody who's still a student, Jeffrey, I'm wondering if you could tell me, when people walk in the front door virtually, so to speak, I'm guessing it's by email or whatnot, to SAFE, students, faculty who are coming to you for support, what kind of stories are they telling you? Are they people who've like witnessed these protests, or their teacher in their classroom is saying things that like along the kind of, well, some would call it despicable, like pro-Hamas positions that you're describing? Are those the phone calls you're getting?
Yeah, they're scared. Parents are scared for their kids. Students are scared certain days to go to campus. If they hear of a particularly potentially violent rally, they may not go to school that day. One of the questions we frequently get asked is it safe to go to campus today? That's a horrifying question that I never thought I would have to answer. Those are the kind of questions we get. There was at Brooklyn College a few weeks ago, there was a vigil. So this is right after October 7th. About a couple days later, there was a vigil. Again, before Israel ever went into Gaza. There was a vigil for the loss of life of the Jews who were massacred on October 7th. A vigil, nothing but a vigil. It wasn't pro-Israel. It wasn't political. It was just a vigil for the lives lost. And that vigil was protested by a pro-Palestinian, I would argue, pro-Hamas group, because they were protesting, memorializing the lives of dead civilians who had just died 1 or 2 days prior in Israel. So students were scared. Students were scared because they had to pass that group to get into the building. And that is the attitude. And what I'm hearing, which upsets me a great deal, by the way, I just want to say I am a huge free speech proponent. Beyond, like, I'm the biggest free speech guy in the world. So it's very interesting that we have this disagreement. I'd like to get into it more.
If I can comment after you finish this thought, because the example that you're giving might satisfy another exception to free speech.
Oh, I'm not saying that violates free speech. I'm not talking about free speech. I'm just bringing that up because.
No, but what I'm saying, Jeff, is that free speech is not absolute. And depending on the factual circumstances, these strict tests may be satisfied by some of the horrifying examples. So in addition to intentional incitement of imminent violence, as you well know, the law defines a so-called true threat or intimidation, which are both punishable when the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear on the part of identifiable individuals that they will be subject to violence. And sensibly, the law doesn't require that the speaker intends to carry out the violence. The mere fact that you reasonably fear violence means that your rights are already being violated. So if students are afraid to go out on campus, and not to mention afraid to exercise their own free speech rights, that may very well be a punishable true threat. Where I think you and I disagree is in terms of general advocacy of even the most despicable positions, anti the existence of Israel and so forth. If it's not targeting particular individuals, that general advocacy, I think, has to be protected. If it's not, then we can get arguments from pro-Hamas people saying, and by the way, I have heard these arguments that, calling them terrorists and saying that that Israel should take revenge and advocating the measures that Israel is pursuing, that's been attacked as hate speech and as advocacy of violence. So we don't want to have double standards here. We want to
the difference is
vigorously advocate policy, but protect individuals against, or groups, identifiable groups of individual from specific harm, such as incitement or threats, or targeted harassment or bullying are also not protected.
So I just have two lines really quick to respond to that. The difference between those two things, Nadine, is that we have now countless examples. Just last week, a man was bashed in the head after some of these, the same language with a megaphone and was murdered. And we have now countless examples of this exact speech being followed by violence to Jews. We don't have any examples that I'm aware of violence being followed by the speech that you're talking about, calling Hamas terrorist or something like that. We have countless examples of the speech that I'm talking about, globalize the Intifada, followed by violence to Jews. Countless examples.
The violence clearly should be punished. And if there is a tight and direct causal connection between the particular speech and violence to a particular person, or threatened violence, as was the case at Cornell, where somebody was arrested and is subject to criminal prosecution because he was targeting the Jewish eating facility, the kosher eating facility, that is appropriately punishable.
Cornell, Harvard, and CUNY all have examples in the past few weeks, just the past few weeks, of this language followed by physical attacks on Jews.
I need to bring Sahar into this conversation.
Please.
Because she's been very patient. And so, Sahar, my first question for you, look, we've just heard a lot of unsettling examples from Jeffrey about how bad things can get. And there's been examples like that here in Canada, where I'm talking to you from. On a day-to-day basis, putting aside some of these horrible examples, on a day-to-day basis, do you see evidence that supporters of Israel and supporters of Palestinian rights, and when I say Palestinian rights, I mean like in the broad legitimate sense, because there's certainly no shame in advocating for the rights of people who live in the West Bank and Gaza, and urging the creation of a Palestinian state, perfectly legitimate political positions. But do you see examples of like a silent majority of people on both sides of that issue as students on campus trying to have civil discussions and not bashing each other on the head with megaphones and stuff like that? Like, could you give us, what has the last month been for you and your fellow classmates?
This is a really interesting question. So I think one thing that needs to be made clear is that the main advocates against Israel and essentially for Hamas on campus are far too extreme to have an interest in dialogue, right? So if you're, at a rally, and we're talking hundreds of students, at least the ones at Yale, shouting resistance is justified, and shouting or having whoever your megaphone person is say, Sahar Tartak's article in the Yale Daily News was an example of bigotry and violence, then you're not having a conversation with Sahar Tartak. And this, I'm only sharing this because it's a true story. In a positive setting. I mean, of course, a lot of people are having conversations with their suite mates, and with their friends. This is something I do all the time. But in an organized fashion, the students who supported, the specific language of Yale's for Palestine was celebrated. What happened on October 7th they're not in the business of dialogue. And just maybe a correction, I guess, to say that to say that these things aren't day to day is just, it's a little bit inaccurate, because they happen on average twice a week, and the fallout of handling them for any Jewish student involved in campus activism is through the week. So I haven't, and my friends haven't had a week of non-insanity, because we have all these resistance is justified, Hamas is a resistance group, student organization advertises a Venmo link on like a program at like a ballet concert that leads you to a page to donate to resistance fighters. There's just a lot of things going on. Like there's direct support of terror, there's speech in support of terror, and it's just happening way more often than it seems like. It's just like you only see the ones that make them into the Wall Street Journal.
So can I ask you a question about that, about the people who are promoting this kind of, I guess you could call it apologism for terror, or maybe worse. I mean, what I've observed is that there is this progressive constituency that presents as we support indigenous people and we support resistance against, you name it, capitalism, oppression, racism, and that there's kind of been a slippery slope from that kind of generalized anti-oppressive dialogue to, as you say, Hamas brands itself as a resistance group and say, well, we support resistance in the context of, like, I don't know, resistance against cis heteronormativity, so I guess we have to support resistance against Zionism or whatnot. Has it been much the same groups and much the same activists and much the same people who support, say, more mainstream progressive causes, who have just, there's been a slippery slope and they've been attracted into this very shrill anti-Israeli rhetoric, or is it a different constituency?
I think it's I think it's largely the same constituency. Like, for sure, many campus leftists are using these sort of
The memes,
pro-Hamas, pro-Hamas rhetoric, tactics, strategy, but it's definitely not just leftists. Like, you're going to have globally, and with a couple of people on college campuses, students that really support sort of, I'm trying to think of a good explanation for this, why it's not leftist. Like, I can just think of activists that, for instance, are like fundamentalist Muslims and therefore are comfortable with Hamas's actions. It doesn't constitute the majority by any means, but like that's there too. Like, Hamas themselves are not leftists, and so all of the young teenage boys who watched their videos on the internet kind of drooling are not leftists either. They probably believe in a really rigid, talk about cis heteronormative system. You'll get some of that as well.
So this is a question I'm also going to be asking Nadine, but I wanted to ask you because one of the people in the Q&A has reminded us that it isn't just the First Amendment of the Constitution that's in operation here. It's also federal laws regarding the funding of universities, which demand that administrators maintain a non-hostile environment for students. Would you describe the environment that you and some of your fellow students have faced on campus as hostile?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing here, is that there is this sort of, at least legally speaking, and of course it applies differently to private universities, but legally speaking, a tension between the promises of free speech and the requirements of Title VI. And I would say that, like most university campuses, first of all, including private ones that normally do not fully embrace free speech and have suddenly decided that they're going to on this issue, that those campuses are not maintaining their Title VI promises. No.
So
Yale's a hostile, discriminatory environment. So is Harvard, so is Columbia, or maybe now Columbia has suspended their SJP chapter, but so was Columbia, and whatever, so is Cornell.
So by the way, just for everyone, like acronyms are flying. When Jeffrey was talking about BDS, that's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. You mentioned SJP, which is
Students for Justice in Palestine.
Okay, and by the way, a lot of these organizations have very nice names. Sometimes the rhetoric doesn't match the
I will
acronyms.
note that if you look on SJP's Instagram, you will find a commemoratory post of a terrorist that organized multiple suicide bombings in Israel.
So just to give a Canadian perspective, we had something similar. McGill University in Montreal, which happens to be my alma mater for undergraduate, had a group called SPHR, which in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks, they praised the terrorists as heroic, was the term they used.
Yeah, I mean, at George Washington University, the words "glory to our martyrs" was depicted projected onto a library.
Okay, so and by the way, I will say in defense of what McGill did, they actually put out a mass communication saying this is abhorrent, and they demanded that SPHR take the word McGill out of their branding because they were so disgusted by it. So sometimes you do see university administrations do the right thing. But again, before I go to Nadine, I want to just ask you a little bit, because this isn't really the battle maybe you thought you'd be fighting on university campus. Like when I interviewed you for Quillette, I guess it was a year, 2 years ago, we weren't talking about anti-Semitism. We were talking about like kind of some of the culture war stuff. Are you surprised? Given all these other battles you fought at high school and maybe you've continued to fight at Yale, like, are you surprised that this is maybe something very basic, the fight against anti-Semitism, that suddenly this has been added to your list of things that you have to fight back on?
Yeah, so I'll actually the first response I have to a question like this one is that I already have a big issue being a major advocate at the university and having had experiences culture war related, because people can't disentangle the two. So you'll have a lot of students saying that like I'm discredited because I have other political views, which of course is absurd. Discredit me for other reasons, but not because some views exist at the same time. No, of course I wasn't necessarily expecting to fight this, terrifying level of anti-Semitism. I knew that there was going to be anti-Israel nonsense on college campus, which is anti-Semitism, but to this extent, I wasn't expecting.
Okay. So Nadine, I'm wondering if you could comment on the Title VI issue, because I don't think anyone's a true free speech absolutist, but you might be the closest that we have on the panel, to that unreachable and probably undesirable extreme. But this Title VI thing, where universities, at least I guess that receive funding, are required not to maintain a hostile atmosphere, sounds great. No one wants to be in a hostile atmosphere, but it also maybe is suitably vague that free speech watchdogs could say, well, that's a backdoor to censorship, because especially in an era when everybody can say, oh, you're making me feel unsafe. And I'm not talking about real safety issues where a mob of people is chanting death to Jews. We're talking about much more marginal cases where people use the word unsafe basically to describe, oh, you disagree with my opinion, so I feel unsafe. What are your feelings about the use of Title VI as a hammer to come down on administrations that are permitting extremely aggressive anti-Israeli, and some might say anti-Semitic, pronouncements on campus?
So first of all, many thanks for the opportunity to participate in this very, very important discussion. I could not be more committed to countering anti-Semitism. As I said again, my family experienced the horrors of the Holocaust directly, and I think one quibble I have with the title of our panel is a suggestion that we somehow have to choose between defending free speech and opposing anti-Semitism. Believe me, my commitment to free speech flows from my commitment to fighting hatred and anti-Semitism, because I believe that no matter how well-intended, censorship ends up doing more harm than good, specifically to those of us with minority views or in minority communities. That said, the First Amendment freedom of speech is not absolute. It does draw sensible lines, empowering government to punish and outlaw the speech that is the most dangerous. Before I talk about the very important question of a hostile environment, I don't want to go any further without saying I strongly agree with Jeff in his praise of Sahar, saying that, you know, you are so unusual for a college student, but Sahar, you are unusual among the ranks of tenured professors. Right, Jeff? We have so many colleagues. I mean, the whole purpose of tenure is to protect academic freedom so that it doesn't even take that much courage to speak out. Now, in fairness, in these fraught times, even tenured professors have lost their jobs or have suffered a lot of repercussions for voicing unpopular positions on their campus. Nonetheless, you know, without any of the protections of tenure, Sahar, your courage is really to be respected. And I think that Title VI and the whole concept of hostile environment harassment is a very legitimate and important, justified exception that to free speech. But as your question suggests, John, as with all of these exceptions to free speech, the devil is in the details. They are fairly general standards that have to be applied in a very fact-specific way, and we always have to be concerned that they are not enforced in such a broad way that they are going to end up stifling speech that we agree with and do not want to be suppressed. So the concept that the Supreme Court has actually said that a hostile environment harassment claim can arise from speech if the speech is so objectively offensive and severe and pervasive that it effectively deprives particular individuals or groups of an equal educational opportunity. Just this, so, you know, some campus situations, sadly, may well satisfy that standard, tough as the standard is. Just this morning, I was beginning to read a complaint that had been filed very recently, within the past week. I believe it was against NYU. Forgive me, I can't remember for sure. The complaint was 83 pages long. I didn't finish reading it, but those 83 pages included just depressing and distressing factual detail that, in my opinion, certainly made a prima facie case, you know, a fact on its face seemed to satisfy that standard, because there was incident after incident after incident that was severe, that was objectively offensive, that to me did seem to have the impact of depriving Jewish students of an equal educational opportunity. And in fact, might even have satisfied the standard of unprotected threats and intimidation. But I do want to hold the line again, to go back to my respectful disagreement with Jeff. If people are advocating general policy just by itself, not taken in the larger context of pervasive harassment, then I would still have to defend even obnoxious, even violent anti-Semitic rhetoric.
So if I can just jump in, because I want to go to Jeffrey now, but with the added detail that, you know, we've been talking about free speech in the context of the First Amendment. We've talked about Title VI. There's the example Nadine just gave. And this is something that's been raised by some of the people, our audience members in the chat. Seems like a fairly obvious point, but I have to admit I didn't think about it. Hamas is a listed terrorist organization, and raising money for Hamas is illegal.
Yep.
Even in Canada, you can't raise money for Hamas. And you can raise money for a lot of things in Canada. So, I'm just thinking where, Sahar, you didn't go into detail, but, you alluded to, you're on some innocuous looking Yale website, and next thing you know, there's a link to like provide funding for a sort of dodgy looking group. I'm guessing, Jeffrey, you're a law professor. You must deal with cases at S.A.F.E that blur into actually providing, or at least advocating for providing support for a listed terrorist organization. Is that something you've encountered in your work?
Unbelievably, yes. We have on my campus, actually, a professor named Anthony Alessandrini, and I should be scared to say his name, but I'm going to take my cue from Sahar and be brave, and I'm going to name him, because he has raised money on our campus in public buildings. We are a public institution using public resources for an NGO connected to the PFLP, which is also terrorist.
And could you tell us what the PFLP is?
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And
by the way, just to be clear, the word connected to is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And I say this as a longtime editor who has conversations with lawyers on the subject of defamation law. So we need to be careful on this. And Jeffrey, I know you will be careful on this, but could you describe the situation and where the line is compared to what this professor has said?
Yeah, I'll give you a citation and everything.
Okay.
So there was actually a New York Daily News article about it a couple of years back, which had an audio tape provided to the Daily News of this professor raising money for a group called MAP. MAP stands for Medical Aid for Palestinians, or Medical Aid for Palestine. That sounds very nice, like you mentioned earlier.
Sounds great.
Doesn't that sound nice? That sounds like a nice thing.
Wait, they're raising money for MAP at Yale too. I feel like I need to be aware of this.
Good. Then I'm glad this came up. Medical Aid for Palestine, NGO Monitor, which monitors NGOs, just like it sounds like, has connected MAP to diverting funds to these terrorist groups. That they are actually, and they were under investigation at some point, and they were actually condemned in Europe for some of their activity, and he was raising money for that group. So we have seen this. And we also know that a lot of money on campuses right now are being funded by Qatar. Qatar is funding colleges around the country and other countries too that have the same,
this is the country of Qatar.
The country of Qatar, yeah.
Yeah.
But you're talking about funding going in the opposite direction. But if I can weigh in on the First Amendment issue, the state of Ron DeSantis in Florida initially called for the elimination of SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, as violating laws against material support for terrorism. And there is both a federal statute, and I guess most states, if not all states, have similar statutes. He was initially basing that simply on the detestable, but as I said earlier, under First Amendment law, constitutionally protected advocacy of terrorism. But if it crosses the line to actually these student organizations actually fundraising and providing tangible material support as opposed to advocacy, that does cross the line, and that does violate these statutes.
And I would just say, I would just say also, because if you don't mind, Nadine, I just want to say one thing about what you spoke about a few minutes ago.
Please.
I think what we're seeing are modern day lynch mobs. When you see, and those are not protected by the First Amendment. Lynch mobs are not protected speech. They never were. And when you see speech that is regularly, not once or twice, regularly leading to physical violence against Jews, those are modern day lynch mobs, not protected by the US Constitution.
Well,
So,
all of us have correctly said we've got to look behind the labels to what's actually involved, right? Like this supposed medical organization. The term lynch mob, Jeff, refers to a mob that is actually engaged in assaulting and murdering somebody. Thank goodness that is not what is happening now.
that is
So
exactly
let's not
what's
use that.
happening.
Let's not use that. If that were happening, that would be criminally punishable as murder. We wouldn't.
Well,
need
what happened to
go after
Kessler?
the-
What happened to Mr. Kessler 2 weeks ago? There were shouts of globalize the Intifada or free Palestine from the river to the sea.
That
And then
does
he was,
not make everybody who participated in shouting those statements, that you cannot impose guilt by association.
Let me jump in on that, because I agree that the term lynch mob has a specific historical connotation, and I think it is important to distinguish it from situations where people use violent rhetoric and then someone does actually go overboard and do something horrific. But I'd like to ask Sahar something, because this discussion we're having goes to the question of the motives of the people who are holding these rallies. And you gave an example, I think, of somebody who actually name-checked you in one of these firebrand speeches on campus. In the chat, one of our audience members was asking whether these people who attend and maybe even lead these seemingly pro-Hamas rallies, how many of them actually believe the most extremist rhetoric that's being spouted? How many of them are actual anti-Semites? And how many of them see themselves as anti-colonialists who are trying to contextualize, that's a word we've seen here in Canada among Hamas apologists, who are trying to contextualize the attacks as a violent but perhaps predictable response to colonialism or apartheid or whatever your favorite term of abuse is. Like, do you have any sense of the mix of actual real anti-Semites versus people who are just perhaps extrapolating the anti-colonialism they're learning about in university and DEI courses to a horrific degree?
I'm going to take their word for it that when they shout resistance is justified, they mean resistance is justified. Now, of course, it's very hard for people with liberal sensibilities to say, I'm comfortable with a mother's breasts being cut off before her children. That's really hard to say. So you can't say it, so you make it clean, right? You make it clean and you call it resistance. Resistance is very clean. But do most of these people support the mom's breasts being cut off in front of her kids? They don't really answer when you ask them. And I have asked them. I have. They flip the question. They look somewhere else. A friend of mine, this is a true story. I asked him 7 times if he would put a baby in an oven, and he could not give me a response. So maybe does that answer the question, that they just can't answer it in the first place, because there's 2 ways to do this, or rather 2 steps, right? There's the denial of the brutality and the justification of the brutality. And even though they're kind of paradoxical, they go hand in hand.
Yeah, well, I mean, the question you just mentioned, I mean, should be an easy question for any human being to answer. We just got a note from somebody who mentioned, and I think it maybe took us to task a little bit for the fact that this has been a very US-centric conversation, which is understandable. All of you are located in the United States. I went to law school in the United States. However, many of our listeners are maybe more interested in an international perspective. And I'm wondering if, and this is open to anybody who wants to answer, what you think about the international response. Like Germany, for instance, had been very strong in supporting protections for Jews in the last 5 or 6 weeks. France has sort of been a mixed bag. The president there has said some alarming things, but then there was 100,000 people who marched in French cities against anti-Semitism. Here in Canada, where we don't have a First Amendment, things are much more loose. We've had university administrators, in some cases at least, come out very strongly against anti-Semitism. I'm wondering if any of you have had a chance to compare what's happening in the United States to what's happening in other Western countries, and whether you see the situation on American campuses as better or worse or just different.
I've certainly followed the international situation, not only recently, but since Europe started adopting anti-hate speech laws very aggressively, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. And that's one of the case studies that I cite. In 2018, I published a book called Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Now note that the only verb in that title is resist. I know, a term that we don't like the way it's been used in other contexts, but I'm advocating doing whatever we can to obliterate hatred. And I believe that history and current experience around the world shows that censorship is not effective. I mean, Germany now has extremely strict anti-hate speech laws, as it did in the Weimar Republic, by the way, during which Hitler and the Nazis rose to power. And we have seen just a frightening rise of anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination and violence in Germany, where, Angela Merkel, while she was still chancellor, felt it necessary to appoint, for the first time in German history, a cabinet-level minister for anti-Semitism. And that person, as well as the head of the Jewish population throughout Germany, issued a warning to Jews that it's not safe to go out everywhere in Germany, including in Berlin, wearing a yarmulke, a skull. For those who aren't familiar, a skull cap that many religious Jewish men feel an obligation to wear, because there was such a danger that you would be subject to being beaten up. Now, and there were many assaults, not to mention attacks on synagogues, and also against refugees and against asylum seekers and immigrants and others. And this has been a pattern in France and Britain as well, where many European Jews feel that their lives aren't safe, despite the existence of very strong laws criminalizing anti-Semitic and other hateful rhetoric. So there certainly is no correlation between suppression of speech and protection of individuals. And, looking at the history of the Weimar Republic, the problem clearly was the failure to protect Jews and other opponents of the Nazis against actual physical assaults and physical violence. And that's why I believe it is, just as I think it's really important not to punish constitutionally protected speech, I believe it's equally important to punish any violence, any assault, any threats, any speech that crosses the line, including by creating a hostile environment. It is equally important for those laws to be enforced and for that unprotected speech to be punished. And I think the examples from other countries simply support those conclusions.
Jeffrey,
I was going to respond to that. This is is it okay, Jonathan?
Oh, yeah. I had another question for you, but please respond.
Ahead.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
I want a chance to agree with Nadine.
Okay. There's always it's always nice to hear that.
I want a chance to stand lockstep with her on this issue. Everything she said, I agree with, and this is a place where we would be lockstep. I think suppressing free speech not only is not a solution to any of these problems, I agree with her that it tends to probably potentially foment it more. If you are an anti-Semite, I strongly believe that hate speech is protected speech. Strongly, with all my heart. Doesn't mean I like it. I want to have the chance to refute somebody who is a hateful bigot. I want to know who they are. Most importantly of all, I want to know who you are. I don't want people being suppressed from telling us who they are. I like those people on Twitter. I don't like them as people, but I like when they go on Twitter and tell us how they feel about Jews and what they think should happen to Jews. You know why? Because now I know who you are. Now I can expose you, and now there could be repercussions in your career, in your academic standing, for the things that you are proposing happen to Jewish people, for your beliefs against Jewish people. Tell me who you are any day of the week, so that I can at least have the opportunity to make you look like a bigoted, horrible, anti-Semitic person, or a racist person, or a homophobic person, whatever it is. Because otherwise, what Nadine said is exactly right. They're just going to go into some hole somewhere and do the same horrible things, but be protected because they're not having to say what they are publicly. And
law enforcement can't monitor them.
100%.
Jeffrey, I mean, I probably spend more time on social media than you guys do because you're more mature than me. But I can tell you that on social media, the rejoinder to the snarky culture war rejoinder to what you just said is, oh, wow, look who likes cancel culture now. And I mean, to be fair, but I kind of agree with what you say. If someone exposes themselves as a bigot, I kind of like the world to know. But there is an element of cancel culture there. I guess some people deserve to be canceled. Yes.
Yes. If I can
Yes.
respond to that, John, because this is a really important and subtle issue. I think, the debates about cancel culture have been reduced to oversimplified binaries. Some cancellations are justified and warranted. Those of us who object to cancel culture, which has been myself, continues to be myself, are only objecting to disproportionately harsh cancellations that therefore create such an intimidating atmosphere that people fear voicing even, legitimate, respectful opinions about divisive, sensitive topics. So, to take an example where I've had many disagreements with many of my friends, I suspect Jeff may draw the line differently from me. I thought that the statements that were issued by 34 Harvard groups, my alma mater, were absolutely deplorable. But I did not support the categorical statements by law firms and other employers that they would not hire any student who was a member of any of those organizations. Now, first of all, they have a legal right to take that position, but those of us who object to cancel culture say, well, even if you have a right to do it, maybe you shouldn't.
It sounds like a blacklist. It sounds like a blacklist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, what I would advocate instead is, rather than this, broad brushed guilt by association, let's get into the details. It's one thing if a student is a leader who actually wrote a statement.
Right.
It's another thing if a student is a passive member, has no idea that the organization even issued the statement. So I would apply the same standards here that I would apply in any other cancellation situation, taking it on a case-by-case basis. Is it justified given the particular infraction and the particular role that the individual played, or is it overly harsh and going to create more of a backlash rather than holding somebody accountable in a fair and just and proportionate way?
Sahar, I'm glad you're here because you're someone who's young and maybe you're still you still have a chance to change your views on the world.
I think all of us do. Never too
well,
old.
no, I mean, Nadine has written 175 books, and so she's committed her views to print, so she can't. It's more difficult for for esteemed veteran professors to change their views, I guess.
If I'm proven wrong, I would happily retract. I mean, I care about being accurate and correct more than
sure, but there's
there's
royalties to think about too. So Sahar, compared to the person you were, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, but certainly a year ago, 2 years ago, have your views on free speech on the acceptable range of opinion that can be expressed in the public sphere, marketplace of ideas, including a university campus, have they changed? Like, eventually this war will end. Eventually these crowds who come out at Yale to shout these nauseating slogans, they'll go back to talking about something else, and things will return to something returning to normal. But have your views been changed maybe permanently about the acceptable line between what can be said on a college campus?
Yeah, so I really don't feel like I know the nitty-gritty of First Amendment law well enough.
Doesn't have to be a legal answer. I'm not looking for a legal answer. I'm looking for because all of us have an internal compass that says these things you really shouldn't say, and these things you should be allowed to say. And obviously the legal context is important, but I mean, with your friends, there's a sort of social contract about the kind of things you could say. And a
Sure,
lot
like
of
an
people,
interpersonal,
yeah,
an interpersonal social contract, like where do I want my peers and I, like where do I
yeah,
want the window to be?
yeah.
I wouldn't say that my views on the window have shifted, because I've always thought that just like, as a social thing.
Like Jeffrey talked about how he
Sure.
likes it when bigots say bigoted things because then we know they're bigots. Have you had people in your circle of friends, people who you thought you respected their views, who, and not just strangers you pass on campus with megaphones, but have you been shocked by the views of some of the people that you know and care about?
Yes, of course. I mean, the story about my friend not being able to answer to whether or not he'd put a baby in an oven is an example of many. I show up to these protests to take pictures and videos, and I see people there that I know and recognize from class. Now, do I want resistance is justified to be an socially acceptable comment? No, it should not be socially acceptable. We should generally view that kind of language as abhorrent. Do I generally believe in shunning those people interpersonally? Like if I'm sitting next to you in class, do I not let you borrow my pencil because you shouted resistance is justified? It's probably a bad idea. I should probably let you borrow my pencil, even though you kind of want me and my family, not kind of, you really want me and my family dead. So it's hard, but I'm being practical. So I sit in my dining hall and I look at the people around me, and it's a crowded dining hall. And I'm thinking to myself, how many people in this room actually want me dead? And the number is not zero. But if I'm in the dining hall with them, what am I supposed to do? What other option do I have?
So you're describing a kind of situation where you're existing on two different social planes, like a kind of practical social plane where you're trying to get along with people, which I guess you have to in that kind of context, and another plane where you just kind of like have to deal with the realization that there are people who have very disturbing geopolitical views which extend to who deserves to live and die.
Beyond practical, I fundamentally believe that we should be, as long as they're not going to shoot it up, I fundamentally believe we should be inviting these people to Shabbat dinner. This is something that I engage in. Not because listen, nobody's getting flipped over Shabbat dinner on their views on Hamas, right? If you like Hamas and I serve you some really good food, I don't suspect that you're suddenly going to hate Hamas. But
So-
I think it can inch you in the right direction.
Has this detracted, because we're all supposed to believe in the power of dialogue, has this jaded you in that respect? Like, maybe how do you have a dialogue with somebody like this? Is it maybe more cynical about
the answer is yes, but the answer is also that there are things that are anterior to dialogue. And one of those things is friendship and good social interactions. And again, as long as they're not going to shoot up Shabbat dinner, which some of them will, then I would invite them to Shabbat dinner.
If I
Because
can,
I won't be able to talk, they definitely won't be okay with me otherwise. Again, this is not to say that we should be inviting Hamas fighters to Shabbat dinner, because they will shoot up Shabbat dinner, and they did, or rather lunch.
Yeah.
But my peers at Yale currently don't have guns.
May I raise an example? So I want to make 2 points. One is, you had asked, John, you had asked Sahar what she thinks about the actual attitudes of the students on her campus. Who can see into somebody else's mind? I have a presumption of innocence and ignorance, by the way. And I would hope that these students are just woefully ignorant and are going along with the crowd and are not really thinking through the consequences of their rhetoric or the meaning of the rhetoric. And I think back to my lifetime on campus during the Vietnam War, where there were many students that were, pro-Fidel and Che Guevara and the North Vietnamese, and saw them as freedom fighters. And I don't think we're consciously, intentionally supporting the cruelty and violence of these communist regimes. The second point so until proven otherwise, I would assume that in some circumstances, through some technique, they might acknowledge that they don't, your friend should have been able to answer that question. I think he was embarrassed that he, but anyway, I'm better than I do, but I hope that most people would not actually support the killing of anybody. Okay, the second point that I wanted to make was, because I am so committed to doing what we can to change people's attitudes and their actions, and I don't think going after speech does either of those. I, ferociously read everything I can about what techniques have worked to persuade people who have been hate mongers to change their views, including memoirs that have been written by former white supremacists and anti-Semites and written about them. So first of all, they never change their views because they're punished. They never change their views because they're canceled. They change, and they don't even change their views when you're haranguing them or preaching at them. They change their views when people superhuman patience that I don't think I would have, engage with them, ask them questions about their views, prod them to rethink their views. You can't do it head on. And one of the best examples that I thought of, Sahar, when you and John were talking about Shabbat dinner, is documented in a book by Eli Saslow, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist at the Washington Post, called, I think it's called A Rising Out of Hatred. And it describes the former leader of a white supremacist student organization, somebody who was born into a white supremacist family. I mean, his godfather was the Grand Wizard of the KKK. And he went to one of the liberal arts institutions in colleges in Florida with the hope of doing opposition research. And the only Orthodox Jew on campus invited him to Shabbat dinner very patiently. And other people at the Shabbat dinner included a Black person and a gay person, all these people that the protagonist thought that he hated, and nobody even lectured at him, but it just got him to question his attitude. And the book just so compellingly describes how he ultimately came to repudiate his views at great cost, because it meant leaving his entire family, his entire background, and going into a world that he thought was going to hate him, because he realized how hateful his views had been. So, Shabbat dinner might lead to positive consequences, except for, I guess, I agree, those who bring guns to it.
So we have a very interesting question here. Jeffrey, I'd like to direct it to you. One of our audience members was asking about some of the rhetorical developments of the last couple of years, where, again, I alluded to it before, terms like safe spaces, or you're making me feel unsafe, and also the verbal conflation of speech and violence, the idea of if you have a disagreement with someone, according to this idiom, you feel yourself to be the victim of violence because you have an emotional reaction to it. I don't want to get into our objections to that kind of language, but I do want to ask, how has this language made it more difficult to do the kind of advocacy you're doing? Because what I see is, if terms like safety and violence kind of lose their meaning and you can use them to describe just mere disagreement, much in the way sometimes the word genocide is thrown around in this bizarrely casual way by opponents of Israel. How has this erosion of language, this misuse of language in many cases, made it more difficult for somebody like you to advocate on behalf of people who really are feeling unsafe because of, we don't have to use the word lynch mob, but certainly the word mob on campus, we've seen videos of that. Has it become difficult to get people's attention simply because language has been mangled and diluted in so many ways in recent years?
Absolutely. I said modern day lynch mob.
Sure. Yeah. No,
I just want to
I know you don't
clarify,
think
I'm
there's
not talking
actual
about
votes,
an
yeah.
actual lynch mob.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when Mr. Kessler is murdered with the
Yeah.
megaphone, I'm sorry, after language that we talked about, that is a modern day lynch mob. I'm sorry. I'm going to stand by that.
Okay.
So, but let me answer your question. Yes, 100% emphatically, the answer to your question is yes. I think the line of the night, that is the thing that's going to stick with me tonight, was uttered by Sahar. And I think it answers your question. I think she answered your question when she said that, and it hit me right in my chest. As a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, it stuck right in my chest when she said this. She said that when she is in the dining hall at Yale University, okay, one of the epitomes of education in our country, the number of people who want to kill her is not zero. The number of people who want to kill her, she said, is not zero. That is stunning. And when you compare that with what you're talking about, silence is violence or microaggressions, you have no right not to be offended on a college campus. You have no right to walk into a classroom and have a professor not offend you. In fact, if you go through college and you've never been offended by a professor, then you haven't had a good college experience. You haven't been challenged. And I think professors have an obligation to challenge their students. I made tons of mistakes when I was in college, and I learned from them. And Nadine thinks I made a ton of mistakes tonight, and maybe I'll learn from those. But you know what? That is no comparison to what Sahar said tonight, which is that the number of people who want to kill her is not zero. It has to be zero. It has to. Yale has an obligation to do everything they can, not to talk about microaggressions and being offended and the right not to be hurt, but to make sure that number, that there is nobody in that dining hall that wants to put a hand on Sahar. That stuck with me. Can
I ask, this is a general question. It comes from the chat, and it's a very good question. And I'm not sure which of you you could just jump in if you want to answer it. Several people have asked about the link between DEI programs and anti-Semitism. And nominally, it's a weird question to ask because I think on the face of it, diversity, equity, and inclusion should be a force against anti-Semitism. However, as we all know, sometimes the ideological tenor of DEI programs is there's a lot of attacks on privilege, there's a lot of attacks on white people, there's a lot of attacks on whiteness, and I mean, there's a lot of attacks on categories that Jews have been lumped into. We won't have to get into the whole bizarre internet subculture of debating whether Jews are white. But is it the case that this officially institutionalized creed of DEI and some of the dubious ideological elements that are embedded in it have kind of created an atmosphere on some campuses where, people are encouraged to take such militant postures against oppression and white oppressors and this and that it's kind of facilitated anti-Semitism through the back door from the left?
Barry Weiss has written a spectacular piece for the Free Press. I think it came out about a week, maybe a little bit more than a week ago, called DEI Has to Be Abolished. And for precisely the reason that you alluded to, John, she talks about how the ideology of DEI programs divides the world specifically into power hierarchies, and oppressor and victim, and Jews have been put on the wrong end of those hierarchies, and anti-Semitism is not seen as a legitimate concern, because to the contrary, Jews are wielding power. I mean, it sounds very much like the old protocols of the elders of Zion in that sense. And she makes, I think, a very compelling case. Quite frankly, I had before that, my position was that DEI has certainly many programs that parade under that very appealing label right on the surface, who could be against diversity, equity, or inclusion. But many of the programs, I think, have been very deeply flawed. But Barry's piece made me think very seriously that maybe the whole enterprise is inherently dangerous to Jews, among other flaws, and maybe we ought to just think about getting rid of it.
We have a good question
Maybe
here.
a link could be put up to that piece. I think viewers would find it very interesting.
Sure, it is Barry Weiss, you said.
Mm-hmm.
We have a good question. It's a good question in itself. It's also a good question because it's so brief. It's 7 letters long, 7 words long. Why are adults in institutions tolerating this? And Jeffrey and Sahar, actually, I think both of you can answer this, because Sahar, you made your name speaking truth to power against adults in institutions, starting with your high school, and so you got a good glimpse into their mindset. And Jeffrey, I'm guessing you've had meetings at your university where you've asked them, so why did you hire this guy? Why are you tolerating this kind of anti-Semitism? And presumably they answered you. These are, you don't get to be university president unless you're smart and accomplished. These are adults. What kind of answer do you have to this question? Why are adults in institutions tolerating this? Jeffrey, maybe I'll start with you, and Sahar, if you'd like to talk about what you learned. And
yeah, I would.
Okay, do you want, actually, Sahar, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, sure. So the reason that this isn't being handled is, I suspect, twofold. One side of the coin is real ideological alignment with pro-Hamas students. You are totally going to get some of that in administrative university circles. Smart people can think crazy things. We just know this to be true. The academics were leading the charge on eugenics. Many of them were popular with the Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. So some people are really steeped in the ideology. That's number one. Number two is others are cowardly, right? So you are worried that as soon as you say that Hamas's actions were bad, maybe even abhorrent, everybody's going to throw up and cry and call you genocidal because you criticized genocide. Now, it is true that many people will get very upset at criticisms of Hamas. Does that mean that you shouldn't say it? No, this is absurd. So the moral bar is just now really, really low, because all anybody has to do is say, I don't really like what happened on October 7th. And then in my mind, they accomplished something. But nonetheless, they're going to get crucified for it by a lot of different people on the campus. I mean, I know I did. When I said that anybody justifying October 7th is, in my view, a hate group, this was like a very, very intense article that I wrote in the Yale Daily News, whole story that came after that. But nonetheless, by writing the article, so many people saying that this is racism, bigotry, hatred. Okay, fine. If you're going to fling that in response to me saying a very, very basic moral point, that's kind of your problem. But administrators are so afraid of controversy, and it's controversy that they built up themselves by creating a DEI regime that uses the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. So they've built up like a sea of people that are ready to attack them for saying that Hamas is bad. And now it's like, oh, well, so then I guess I can't say it because all these people who work underneath me or are my students or are paying tuition here are going to get really upset.
Jeffrey, some of the people that you've criticized, maybe your university for hiring, were they hired for DEI reasons?
Well, there is a very robust hiring strategy at CUNY, and I've really criticized CUNY from the highest levels in their I'm not talking about individual hires necessarily. I'm talking about systemized anti-Semitism. CUNY is in a city of 20% Jews. New York City is 20% Jewish. CUNY was formed in 1961. Since 1961, for the first time in CUNY's history, we have 0 Jewish people in its senior administration. 0 Jewish people in the senior, and that's 45 administrators. And we have 25 campus presidents. Out of the 25 campus presidents, at one time there were 7, 8, 9 Jewish campus presidents. We now have 0 permanent campus presidents that are
But have
Jewish.
you talked to administrators about this? Like, have you got meetings with, and what do they say? Well, specifically when, bringing this back to the conversation we've had, like on the issue of anti-Semitism, I don't know if you've spoken in the last 5 or 6 weeks. Like, do they give you a coherent response on this subject?
No, they give you a stock line. They give you boilerplate language from their EEO policy. CUNY does not discriminate based on yada, yada, yada. They don't give a real answer, but the real answer is this has been a methodical, purposeful, premeditated plan to eliminate Jews from CUNY. And not just Jews, I would also say white people. And they would argue in their defense, well, we're just trying to increase diversity. But diversity means something very different today at universities than the diversity that I learned when I was in school, which actually meant diversity, real diversity, all different people, no matter, regardless of your color, regardless of your creed, regardless of your religion, regardless of your ethnicity. And, Nadine and Sahar covered very well the oppressor versus the oppressed thing. So I'm not going to get into that. But what I will say is, because you originally started this, Jonathan, with a great question, that somebody asked, why are adults, I don't remember the exact words, why are they scared to do the right thing? Or
why are adults and institutions tolerating this?
So I'll tell you why. Because there is still a small percentage of administrators and faculty on campuses. There's a certain threshold amount that really are anti-Semitic. They really are, that are deeply, horribly anti-Semitic. And then there's another segment, maybe, I don't know if it's equal or a little bit more, that are just scared to do anything to get the loudest people to act up. And the way it works is just the reality. The Jewish people who are defending themselves have not acted in the same way as the pro-Hamas crowd has. They don't say things like from the river to the sea. They haven't caused property damage, and the White House was vandalized by those pro-Hamas groups. And you have people, like I said, who were injured at these pro-Hamas rallies. And so the administrators who are kowtowing to this are scared because they're louder, they're scarier. Sarah Silverman said something very interesting in a book that she wrote a few years ago. And somebody asked her, why is it that you go after Christianity? Because she really makes fun of Christianity a lot. And she makes fun of Judaism a lot. And most of us know she's Jewish. But she never attacks radical Islam. Never. She's never attacks radical Islam. Never. And somebody asked her a great question. I've heard you attack extremists who are Jewish. I've heard you attack extremists who are Christians. How come you never go after radical Islamists? And she gave a really honest answer. She said, because there's no chance that the Jewish person is going to blow me up. That's what she said. And it was half a joke, but it was half serious. And if you look at the reality today, and I don't think that's true, don't get me wrong, I am not saying that about the overwhelming majority of Muslims. I'm not saying that. But if you look at the extremists, I'm talking about the extremist element who are out there, the Islamists the ones that Sahar are talking about, that not 0% that want her dead, which is a horrifying thing to hear. And she's worried about that. They're not worried about that from the other side. Nobody from the other side is worried that a Jewish person is going to kill them. They do think the number is 0. And
Okay,
that's
so the Sarah Silverman factor is one answer to this question. That's a good line, a characteristically good line from Sarah Silverman. So we're going to wrap up soon, and the big boss is going to come in and say a few words. Before we do that, Nadine, we have one more question. It's one of these questions that I really should have asked earlier. It's a good question. I'm going to ask you for, unfortunately, a brief answer. Someone asked, if you have a professor, maybe a tenured professor, who says something truly outrageous in the vein of what we're talking about, comes into global studies class and says, hey, speaking of global studies, I was really happy about what happened on October 7th. It's great to see the downtrodden of the world rise up and really stick it to the oppressor. Should that person be fired?
Not necessarily fired, but definitely some kind of investigation and discipline would be appropriate. And I'm going to go back to that point I've been making over and over and over again. The devil is in the details, context matters, and a classroom situation where the professor has a professional responsibility to teach the subject matter, not to try to indoctrinate, especially under the American Association of University Professor Standards, that is not protected speech. Firing may be a disproportionately harsh punishment, but some kind of discipline would probably be warranted.
Okay. I would now invite Monica Harris to come conclude these proceedings.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists tonight. I'm Monica Harris, Executive Director of FAIR, and I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight to hear our panelists discuss this timely and enlightening conversation about an issue of vital concern to millions of Americans. FAIR was born of the belief that we can and must respect our common humanity while also respecting our individual differences. But it's a message that's it's becoming increasingly difficult to convey as we face a seemingly never-ending stream of issues that divide and inflame us. And we in FAIR believe in discussing openly and honestly the complex and often difficult issues that keep us from seeing our common humanity. That's what we attempted to do here tonight. And this is the work that we in FAIR are committed to doing every day. So, as you may know, FAIR operates entirely on donations, and we do this through generous gifts from people like you. So if you appreciate the work that FAIR is doing and that we did here tonight, we invite you to consider making a donation to FAIR. And you can find a link to our donation page in the chat. So once again, thank you very much, Jonathan, Nadine, Jeffrey, Sahar, and everyone who attended tonight. It was wonderful, and I hope you all got something out of it.
Thank you.